morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the formerly known as Title 21 Committee. Now I have to look at the agenda to remember what our name is. Community and Economic Development Committee, right? I'm doing that from memory.
Parentheses, Title 21.
Parentheses, yeah.
I think you've usurped me. My title is a marijuana, whatever. I think your title's longer now.
Well, that was the goal.
Yeah, but yours will wake out of existence.
As long as it's possible. So we'll start this morning with introductions, and Mr. Evans will begin with you.
Sure, Bill Evans, Anchorage Assembly.
Dick Train Anchorage Assembly.
Amy Domboski.
Bernie Hall.
Jennifer Johnston.
Pete Peterson.
Tyler Robinson, Planning and Zoning Commission.
Well, welcome. And I'm very excited to announce this morning that the chair has notified the clerk that he has appointed 2 members from the Planning and Zoning Committee as ex officio members of this committee, Tyler Robinson and Tony Kange. And then there's an alternate, which is Brandon Sporehouse. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but close enough, right?
Yep.
And then, if we could, I'd like to go around the room, just for the record. This meeting is being recorded, so please speak loudly, but please introduce yourselves, and if you're representing a company, please let us know, or a community council. So we will start right there.
Jason Bachman with GCI.
Becky McPherson, also with GCI. Erin Elam with Okludna.
Steve Connolly with Okludna.
Heather Nolan, just a resident. Teresa Arnold, resident.
Frank Bickford, lobbyist, Verizon.
Mark Hill, Singing Foothills Community Council President.
Tony Sisto, resident.
Julianne Inglis with Planning and Zoning.
Quincy Arms with the MLA Department of Law.
John O'Day.
John Weddleton.
Julia Tucker with the Assembly Council Office.
Sharon Easley and Legislative Mr. Tree.
Jake Moe with Municipal Light and Power.
Kristen Collins, resident.
I'm Lance Powell with the Mid-Hillside Community Council.
Erica McConnell from Planning.
Wonderful. Well, welcome all this morning. Oh, okay. Is there anyone on the phone this morning?
Yes, my name is Ken Lyons, first law firm on behalf of AT&T.
Ken Lyons.
Ken Lyons with AT&T. All right, good morning. Oh, great. And Chris Schutte has joined us.
Is this taken?
Yep, it's for you. And Chris is with the mayor's office.
And none of us are dressing quite as snazzy.
No.
Yeah, I thought he was going to wear his blue.
I would wear my sunglasses if I know he had that on. Jason
right.
Penny had a sale. It jumped out at me.
Well,
Okay, I'm ready now.
before we start with the cell tower discussion, members had an opportunity to look at the agenda. Are there any modifications or assembly member comments? Any comments, Tyler? All righty, Chris, do you have anything for us?
No, ma'am.
All right, wonderful. Okay, with that said, we're going to go ahead and start with our cell tower discussion. We asked the planning department last week, and they were so kind to do this very quick notice, to give us a basic PowerPoint presentation on our current, what we have in Title 21, the current process to get a cell phone tower. One thing we all know as community members, when in front of our community councils, one of the biggest issues we have is cell phone towers. They come in front of the council, they're always contentious, and for years people have been asking for one unified policy, something we can measure, something we can expect. Now, in current technology, sometimes they're looking like trees or water towers or anything else. So this is a good opportunity to not only have the discussion of where we're at, but where we could potentially go. And because of that, I felt it was very important to invite the industry to come to the table, because they give us technical knowledge of this is what's realistic and this is what we have to provide service. And this is a discussion that recently was had at my community council, as far as asking the one carrier to make a cell tower taller. That way we didn't have to have 2 or 3 cell towers in the same area. So it's a good conversation to have, but I think it's very important to have industry at the table. So I appreciate AT&T and GCI, and I'm glad somebody from Verizon came, because I was like death by touch button last week when I was trying to catch somebody. So I'm glad you're all here, and with that, Erica will let you take it away. Erica McConnell is the planning manager for the municipality.
Thank you. This is just a brief presentation to talk about
what the current code has about towers, some of the issues that we feel need to be addressed in a rewrite, and some of the concerns that we will have going forward with the rewrite. So through the rewrite process, there was a new regulations proposed for cell towers, but the revisions that were done by our consultants out of Colorado raised enough concerns within the telecommunications industry that everybody agreed that we would bring forward the old code regulations into the new code and do a new rewrite process afterwards. This decision was probably made in 2005, I'm guessing. Nobody really thinking that it would take this long, but here we are. Within the code, there are 4 different types of towers. Type 1 is the monopole. This is the most common tower that we see. Type 2 is a lattice tower. Type 3 is a guy wire tower, and Type 4 is camouflaged, either tower or antennas. The review process depends on the zoning, the type of tower, the zoning, and the details of the proposal. Some types of towers have to go through an administrative site plan review or site selection, which is approved by the director. In many zoning districts, if you don't meet the supplementary district standards for towers that would put you through the administrative site plan process, you may go to the Planning and Zoning Commission for a conditional use permit, which allows you to request any sort of deviation from the supplementary district standards. After you have your either site plan review approval or conditional use approval, if either of those are required, you do need to get a building permit through, or a land use permit through the Development Services Department, and you need antenna permits, which are given out through the Planning Department. So for type 1, 2, and 3 towers within commercial or industrial districts, they generally do not need a review from the Planning Department. They need a land use permit from a building or a land use permit from the Building Safety Development Services. They are still subject to the standards set forth in the code, and if they don't want to comply with those standards, they still can go to get a conditional use from Planning and Zoning. The exception is that in the B1A, B1B, and watershed districts, there is a notification requirement to surrounding properties within 500 feet, and then you still need to get your antenna permits. In residential or PLI districts, there is a required administrative site plan review, assuming that you meet the supplementary district standards. If you want to exceed height requirements or other types of things, again, you can apply for conditional use. In residential districts, they're only allowed to be accessory to a non-residential use, so you have to find some non-residential use within a residential district, such as a church, a utility substation, or a school, that sort of thing. There is a required notification of property owners within 500 feet. Through the review, we apply the conditional use factors in determining whether or not the approval is appropriate, and if the applicant doesn't agree with the director's determination, there is an appeal to the Planning and Zoning Commission. Once the site plan is approved, there needs to be a building or land use permit from Development Services and the antenna permits from Land Use Review, which is part of planning. Type 4 towers, these are the stealth or camouflage towers. They require a new type of stealth design to go to the Planning and Zoning Commission for design approval. So this is not an approval of a location. This is the Planning and Zoning Commission reviewing the stealth design to make sure that it meets the code requirements, which are actually in the definition of a Type 4 tower, that basically you can't tell it's a tower or an antenna. It's camouflaged appropriately. And to date, we've only processed one of those just within the last month. And this is the tree tower, what they call a monopine, down in Birdwood. For getting an antenna permit, you submit an application to the land use review section and obtain your applicable building or land use permit. These have a very quick turnaround, so these are not something that takes a long time.
And just to clarify, so for the antenna ones, are you talking about the ones that are going on top of existing poles?
Yes. So placing antennas on towers that have an approval, placing antennas on buildings, placing antennas on anything you need to get an antenna permit.
Okay.
So the department's recognized that there are changes needed to this section. We've recognized this for a long time. There are elements of this section which are confusing. There are provisions or processes which it's not really clear which situations the processes apply to, and there is no guidance provided for certain situations. For example, placing towers in the right-of-way, the situation I'm sure you're all familiar with the antenna that was proposed on top of a electrical pole, and there are recent Federal Communication Commission rulemaking guidelines for increasing or for adding to existing facilities height or additional infrastructure, and there are rules from the federal government about how we have to handle those things, and these things are not addressed in our code at all. So the rewrite in our judgment should address a lot of, I have 2 slides on issues to be addressed. It should address how we're going to treat towers proposed for the rights of way, how we're going to treat antennas on existing infrastructure. The department has historically said if you put an antenna on top of a pole that was, say an electrical power pole, it becomes a tower. Is that appropriate? I don't know. But that's something that could be discussed. We need to address the FCC rulemaking on facility modifications, and Quincy's here to answer questions about that. But one of the things that it says is that if you, there are certain types of modifications that we must allow and cannot deny. And so that means we need to address that in some way. We should discuss the location of where towers can be put. Can we allow them as principal uses on a vacant lot? If, as their accessory uses, can they be accessory to what types of things? Can they be accessory to residential or multifamily uses? That should be a discussion that we have. But we must consider that these towers generally come with generators, and so we need to make sure that we're not forgetting that these generators do create noise issues. We should talk about height. It's my understanding that, and I'm not in the telecommunications industry, but it's my understanding that as there is more use of mobile devices that require are using data transmission, that each antenna can only accommodate so much data transactions, and so you need to have, as the load on the system gets greater, you need to have more towers, but I understand they can be lower. But then there's also the concept of being higher and covering more area. So height will need to be an issue. Co-location, how to encourage co-location, which is having as many antennas as you can have on one tower rather than having multiple towers with fewer antennas. The appropriate approval processes, design, what design is appropriate where, when, or do we want to require some towers or antennas to be camouflaged? If we do, in what situations? How will we address non-conformities? Because of course we have a lot of existing towers out there, and other types of appropriate standards. I just wanted to show you some stealth tower examples because they're kind of fun to look at. One of the things we have heard is that it is actually burdensome to have a stealth tower approved, and so we're not doing anything to encourage or incentivize camouflage towers. On the left, you see a tree that is actually a tower. On the right, I understand the top of that lamppost is a very small tower. There's this thing called small cell. I forget what it's called, small cell something. But it's my understanding that in some discrete areas you can have a bunch of very, very small antennas that create a cell network. On the left, this is some sort of bell tower art installation in a public space that is also a cell tower, and on the right is a piece of buffalo art that is also a cell tower. So you can see that there can be very innovative ways to provide cell service. And then here on the left, to the left of that window is an antenna that is disguised on this church steeple.
Can you go back to that one again? Where's the tower? I'm missing it.
On the left.
On the left side of the window.
Oh, right there.
Antenna.
Oh.
Well, it's disguised.
Yeah, it really is. It's like, where's Waldo?
So the challenges include encouraging versus requiring co-location. One of the issues with co-location is if you put in a regulation that says, well, if you have a tower within a certain distance from the place you want to put a tower that has space, well, then you must co-locate there. Well, that gives that tower owner the ability to charge a rent that is out of scale with what would be a market rate rent because they are being forced to go onto that tower by the municipality. So that, that gives the tower owner the ability to kind of hold the new antenna person over a barrel. So that's one of the difficult things about co-location. Changing technology, which is also related to number 3, and I think you've heard number 3 through my presentation, the lack of technical expertise on staff. We don't have anyone in the planning department who knows a whole lot about telecommunication issues, so we're being asked to make judgments and review issues where we just don't know a whole lot, and so that it is challenging because we can't really review from an objective perspective. And then the fourth challenge would be just the kind of what you mentioned at the beginning, that people don't want towers near their homes, and so that is a big challenge. That was all that I had. We had originally had some lists of potential ways we could go forward, but I really didn't feel prepared to go through those in detail, so I thought maybe it was a little early to do that.
This is great because it gives, I've already seen lots of questions. It's a great opportunity. Ms. Johnson and Mr. Trainee.
As far as your list of things to be addressed, I think we also need to address, because I remember talking about this, none of us really knew what we were talking about with both wind and cell, is the whole earthquake effect on towers. And I have a question for industry, and this might be...
I'm going to definitely, I'm going to bring them up to the table.
Okay, but...
you can throw it out there.
Throw it out there, just because it might take a lot, and it might be a stupid question. But I know with Wi-Fi, like in Madrid now, they have Wi-Fi on their buses, so basically the whole city of Madrid is connected to Wi-Fi, and it's a public. Are we getting close to any kind of technology like that with cellular? Because that's, where you... The small cellular systems, like we saw on the lamppost, I know you can do in sort of a residential area, but I just was wondering if there's something similar where publicly it's more than just, it's going beyond a cell tower.
Becky, you want to try that one?
Sure, I can try that. With the caveat that I'm an attorney and not an engineer, but I've had a lot of conversations about this with our engineering team to try and understand, because this issue comes up in every community we go into, whether or not we could, in lieu of a tower, have small cell technology. And I think there are a couple issues in Alaska. The first thing is that small cell technology is difficult to implement in areas where there's variable topography and where there's a lot of vegetation. A lot of the places where it's effective is in high, densely populated urban areas where there isn't, it's flatter, you're not dealing with mountains, you're not dealing with a relatively sprawling population. And then second of all, our network just kind of isn't there yet. There are still areas where we need to fill in the macro cell of availability through the construction of towers. And then as we need to increase capacity, as Erica mentioned, as we have more population density in an area where there may be an existing tower, then we can fill in gaps with small cell technology, but we're not quite there yet with our network in Anchorage or really anywhere in Alaska. So, it's a question that comes up all the time. It's a good question. It's something we'd like to pursue in the future, but we're not quite there yet for a couple of reasons.
That makes sense. The other thing on the list, and we've had this on the hillside besides earthquake, is wind and the effect of wind.
Mr. Trainee.
Erica, just a question. I know we notify the residents within 500 feet, but my concern is notifying people that are not property owners, because we notify property owners, but we've got a lot of areas that are highly residential with their apartments. I want to make sure we have a way to get out to all the residents. Maybe
Right.
some sort of zoning requirement.
Well, in the new code, we've changed our general notice requirements to require notification to residents as well as owners. So what we'll need to do is we work on revising this section, is that in those situations where we feel notice is appropriate, we just need to link it back to the general notice provisions rather than have a separate process listed in this section like it is now.
Okay, just want to make sure we cover that.
Got it.
That's a continual problem. The other problem with cell towers is people that are worried it's going to land on their property if it falls over.
Well, that's the earthquake and the wind.
I know, I've got that problem up Northern Lights. They're always concerned it may hit.
Are there any other questions from committee members or Mr. Schutte?
No, thank you.
Okay. Are there any questions from industry to the planning department? Okay. Are there any questions from the public?
I have a question.
Sure. And can you please state your name? So we're clear?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Lance Powell, and I'm not sure if this can be answered, but is there a rough cost to make a tower stealth? Can anyone answer that?
It's about 300% of the cost of a non-stealth tower. It's about 3 times.
So 300%, that's good. So what is the original cost?
It depends on the location, it depends on where we're building, what we're doing.
Is there a way you can roughly just say?
It's in the hundreds of thousands. But again, it depends. I've seen projects priced at a wide array depending on what we're doing, where we are. They cost a lot more to put in Fairbanks than even Anchorage. So I apologize, I can't give you an exact number, but it's roughly 3 times the cost of a standard monopole tower to do a stealth tower. Is our understanding at this time, and you also have to take the caveat that we're about to build our first stealth tower in Anchorage, and so we haven't done a large number of these, and no provider in Anchorage has done a large number of these.
It probably just depends on the design of the stealth tower.
Yeah,
Some
it
are
depends
gonna
on
be more
if it's-
expensive than others.
Exactly, that's a good point as well. I'm thinking primarily of the modern high structure.
Amy?
Yes. And again, just before you talk, for the record, just say your name again.
My name is Tony Sisto, resident Judiac. Just a question on towers that outdate themselves or no longer used. When I pulled up a Google site, there were several on there listed as no longer usable, and I'm just wondering if there can be some protocol if a tower goes out of date because of new technology and the tower is just sitting there, there can be a requirement that it's removed.
And I'm sorry, I missed part of the question, but there is a provision that towers that are no longer being used be removed.
Oh, okay.
The problem is
It's enforcement.
us knowing
No,
that a tower
yeah.
is no longer being used. We don't
Okay.
always know that.
Are there any other questions before we move on? Yes.
A quick question. My name's Heather Nolan, and it sounds like GCI is aware of some of the concerns with wanting some of these smaller antennas around residential areas. And I keep hearing that you know that this is an issue, but I haven't really heard any timeline or schedule about when you're actually going to be looking at these. Because what I did hear from Nick Miller with the AWN is that the technology is here. It would be here in 2015. We're now well into 2015. But I'm still not hearing any schedules or any dates. So do you have any of that information?
I don't have anything concrete. I mean, I would say that every time we propose a tower project, it's because we need a tower in the area, because it's a need that can't be addressed at this point with small cell technology, and we think about other alternatives definitely in each instance. We also think about things like whether or not we can be on a tall building in the area, whether or not we can be on a power pole instead of on a new cell tower structure, whether we can co-locate. For us, it's always cheaper if we can be on an existing structure. We'd like to be on existing structures, so we are considering things as they come along. I unfortunately don't have any solid time frame of when the network is going to be built out enough that we can start thinking more about small cell solutions and less about needing to do tower construction. But we definitely are thinking about that and like to do it as it becomes possible. Again, for us, it's going to be cheaper to put small cell antenna up than it will be to put up, build a giant tower structure. But we're just not quite there yet.
I appreciate that. Are there any other questions before we move on? All right. Quincy, do you want to give us kind of an overall FCC, what the general rules are, or do you want to go after maybe GCI to fill in the gaps?
Either way.
Go ahead.
I won't take too long, Erica. Erica knows almost as much as me at this point, but I'm working on getting up to speed. The new FCC rules that she's talking about, that we as a municipality are required to approve certain applications. So The language is may not deny and shall approve any eligible facilities requests for co-locations. So existing towers that providers want to put new antennas on. So I think a problem or how we're going to have to approach it is think about, right now some applications are required to go through a really long conditional use process. We're going to have to look at, beefing that up a little bit. So it's very specific situations, and Eric and I have already talked about it, that we're probably going to have a special category for these, for the applications that fall under this category, so it's kind of fast-tracked, because there's a 60-day time limit for approval. And the remedy, if we don't get it done in 60 days, is they can go ahead and put the tower, or put the antenna up.
And this can mean increasing the tower height.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. So
good reason to make sure that there's a mechanism that we can review them before that 60 days.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point.
And
yes, Mr. Trainee has a question for
We're
you.
going to have to deal with the community councils then, because many of them don't meet on a regular schedule basis, especially in the summertime. So the requirements to go to community council, we're going to have to speed that up.
Right. It's gonna take a lot of work. But.
Well, and interesting enough, I mean, in the marijuana committee, we have that other mechanism, or it's being talked about, or another public meeting.
Yeah, a community meeting of some kind.
Yeah.
We have to go to that.
But, I think that, again, this is how I counsel my community councils is, we send out the notices, have somebody assigned to watch those P&Z notices. Because if something important, like a cell tower that is going to be a hot button topic, sometimes you have to have a meeting this summer. Yeah. Tyler.
Tyler Robinson. Does that mean that if you have an existing tower that's below a height that would have otherwise required a conditional use permit, and the height increase puts it, in above that height, that it would still be exempted? Or there still be a requirement that it be a by right use, even though it's otherwise getting into that area?
As long as it's not how the statute defines it as a substantial change in physical dimensions. So they have this really complicated long formula to determine if it's a substantial change. And so for height, just speaking in generalities, it's a 10% increase. So if you're proposing a 10% increase over a 10% increase in height, it's become a substantial change, and we're not required to approve it. And it would just fall under a different process. But if you're looking at making just a small increase in height, then yes, we're.
And that cutoff is not 90 feet in a lot of instances. Is that what it is?
It's 65 feet in residential districts, and I'd have to look.
But it's the 10% rule that if it's above 10%, then.
Then what's the correct?
If it's helpful, it's 10% or 20 feet, whichever is greater.
Oh,
and
greater.
Yeah, I can speak to it more in my comments if it's helpful. But it's basically designed to encourage co-location so that you can add that addition to an existing tower, which is seen as a more favorable option than having to build. I've heard some comments about places in town where we have 2 towers or 2 provider towers within 20 feet of each other. And the idea with this FCC rulemaking was to try and encourage, for that kind of instance, the addition of 20 feet to an existing tower in lieu of a new tower right now.
No, I get that. It seems like there's an opportunity there to bypass the system if you want to play it that way.
Yeah. I mean, I understand. I think it's going to be a challenging thing to get everyone's heads around across the state. We've got to run into this. Well, okay, you can get 20 feet, so we're just going to shave 20 feet out, whatever you're asking for. And the challenge, then we run into sort of back engineering challenges. Do we engineer a tower that's 100 feet tall? Do we engineer for 120 feet and then ask later for the 20 feet? We're kind of in a little bit of a limbo land if it's applied that way. I do understand the concern, but I think the intent is to certainly make co-location possible and not lead to a proliferation of towers.
Mr. Trainee?
Is there a limit on how often they can come in for this change? Because I could see somebody, well, we got 20 feet now, next week we'll be in for another 20 feet. There's something built into the system.
There is a limit. It's once. The order allows you only to come back once.
Per year or just once totally? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, is that it, Quincy?
Short and sweet.
We may have more questions, so, all right. Next is the opportunity for industry to have an opportunity to speak. So if you guys want to come up to the table. And we have had 3 new people come into the room.
Cheryl Richardson.
Mr. Weaver. Welcome. And I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Billy Whaling.
Billy, welcome. And do you represent a company or?
I work for GCI.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yep, scooch on up. If you want to come up, you can come up too, Jason. Okay.
He's gonna leave me here alone.
All right, so for members, if you checked your email last night, Becky did send us a letter that outlined multiple issues that GCI has encountered and just points of discussion. And Tyler, I think you got a copy of that today. It is on the table, or it was on the table there. Yeah, so what I think I'll do, this is a fantastic, just a straightforward perspective from the industry, the things that they bump up against sometimes. So I think what we'll try to do is the presentation that Erica gave today and the perspective from GCI, I think we're going to try to get them put up on the Assembly's webpage so anybody who wants to see them can see them and share with your councils. All right, with that, go right ahead.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you again for the opportunity to be here today and share our perspective. As noted, I'm Becky Wynn-Pearson. I'm in-house land use counsel for GCI. Who submitted written comments last night. So today I just wanted to speak briefly to summary points from those written comments and then address any questions that I can be helpful with. We definitely understand this is a challenging issue to confront, and we're really pleased that the Assembly is taking it on right now. Just like any other, utility service or other services required for economic development, access to competitive cutting-edge wireless service is really crucial for the development of Anchorage. We live in the era of the mobile workforce and the wireless-only family, and the demand for services that GCI and AT&T and Verizon and our other competitors provide is only going to grow. And as it does grow, we are going to need to propose new tower projects in areas where there is existing dense population. As Erica noted again, when we have a dense population of people, we need additional towers to provide additional capacity. And then we also will be proposing potential new tower projects in outlying areas of the city to expand our service area and be able to provide service to people who currently don't have our services. In the end, though, I actually think the needs of the municipality and the needs of the industry and the needs of the neighboring community members for a tower ordinance are largely aligned. We all just need a code that's clear, consistent, reasonable, and reliable. We need a code that makes clear what procedural and substantive requirements apply to each project and who the decision maker is at each step of the process. We recently had an appeal in front of the Board of Adjustment, and one of the things the board noted in their process was it shouldn't be this hard to figure out what the standard is and who makes the decision, and we would agree with that. I think that in a revised ordinance, we'd like to see that change. We need a code that's reasonable and reflects the outcomes we actually really want to see. There's a 200% of tower height fall radius in the current code, which just isn't really a logical protection. There's really no way that a tower can fall 200% of its height, nor can any other structure in the municipality do that. And this kind of blanket requirement really prevents us from thinking about other creative solutions that might help to otherwise minimize impacts on the community. It prevents construction of towers in locations where they might be tucked more out of the way. It also is a challenge in thinking about these power pole extensions, which can be a less obtrusive alternative in parts of the community. We need a code that's consistently and reliably applied to all projects, to all providers, and to all neighborhoods. If the municipality wants to explore requiring the use of the stealth towers or monopine towers, it really needs to be clear how these decisions are made, where in the city they might be most useful, and how we'll determine when and how to deploy these structures, which are currently untested in Alaska. And we do have some concerns about the engineering of the branches and these other components of the towers in light of the fact that we live in a unique environment where we have a lot of snow and ice concerns, we have seismic issues, we have wind concerns that maybe don't all exist at the same time in other parts of the country where these towers are used more often. And we need a code that actively incentivizes the results the municipality wants to see. You all know we've recently had this utility pole extension project, and if that's a desirable option, those should be easier to permit. If it's not a desirable option, that's fine, but it seems like it's something that's desirable from the municipality's perspective, from the neighbor's perspective, to do that in lieu of new tower construction. So it would make sense to have a process for that makes those an easier option for the industry to put together. And finally, we need a code that works in Alaska. We face a unique combination of circumstances in our city in a variety of different ways. And so on that, I'd say that if a consultant is engaged to work on this project, we'd really support the engagement of a local consultant, someone who knows Anchorage and knows Alaska, and rather than trying to apply a cookie cutter model from California or from Colorado to our city, I think the local consultant could go a long way toward making a new ordinance something that's workable here. And in conclusion, I just really want to encourage you to take advantage of the local industry as a resource in this process. If we can be useful, we've provided some specific thoughts and feedback in our written comments, and we're happy to provide more specific feedback as the process goes on. We have a whole stable of engineers. I mean, I'd give you my sort of lawyerly take on what the engineers have told me, but we do have a lot of engineers who would be happy to come and, provide more insight into how the process works. We have a lot of questions raised often about why do we need to build where we need to build, why do we need to build towers, why do there have to be more of them? Those are questions that we have a lot of engineers that would be happy to come and answer, provide additional education to whoever's working on this project to be able to give some insight into that process. We talked about small cell technology, also tower height. That's a complicated engineering decision. One of the things that goes into that question is the frequency that a provider operates at. GCI operates at a different frequency than the national providers, so sometimes that impacts how tall our towers need to be. And so there's a lot of different things that come into play in making that decision, which again might be something where engineers could be useful as an education piece. We have provided tours of our facilities for regulators in other contexts. The RCA comes and looks at our facilities often, so that's a useful piece. Again, anything that we can provide to be helpful in this process, we're happy to do so, and I hope that you'll call on us as you see fit. So thank you again for your time today. If there's anything else, any other questions I can answer, just let me know.
Are there any questions from assembly members?
Yeah, I'm curious about the capacity of a tower. Does the size of a tower make the difference in the capacity, the height?
It does make a difference in the coverage area. It doesn't make a difference in terms of how many providers can be hooked into that at the same time, but it does make a difference into how many people, the square footage area where a provider could potentially connect to that tower and have access.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Chris.
When carriers are looking for sites for new towers and identify a site that works for their network, is there any collaboration between the carriers to say, for example, hey, we found a site, we're building this 75-foot tower, would you guys like to lease space on this tower for your antenna? Is that common? It seems counterintuitive, but I'm just wondering.
No, we do. I mean, we do usually, especially in municipalities where there's a co-location requirement. Again, that's a good thing to think about. We will definitely reach out to other providers and let them know that we're going to be constructing a location. Sometimes we've been required to submit, letters of intent to or interest in co-locating on the tower. And we always, again, look at other co-location opportunities. If we're looking at an area, we look at every tower that might be in that area, and we do an RF propagation study to see if that tower might be possible for our needs and prevent the need to build a new tower.
Jennifer, then Tyler.
Do you see any involvement as far as the RCA when it comes to tower development?
Tower development. I don't anticipate it because we're not a regulated industry. This element, parts of what GCI does is a regulated industry. We're in front of them for wireline telephony all the time, but because wireless communications are not regulated in the same way, at least in the immediate future, I don't anticipate RCA involvement.
Can you maybe comment on site selection process, and at least from my standpoint, maybe the questions that you often get of whether you've looked at enough sites, and sort of, I sense frustration on, what you present as a thorough site selection process, but often I think you hear back, well, did you think about this? Did you think about that? And it seems to just send you back to the drawing board.
Sure. So what we usually do is we start with a propagation map and with an engineering decision about where we need a new tower in order to fill a gap in our system. And so what our engineers will do is they pinpoint an idealized hypothetical design plan and map, and they say, in a world where we could have any property and where the topography was flat, we want a tower right here. And then that decision goes to our site acquisition team, and they look at that spot. And basically there's sort of a half-mile margin of error for that site. So they look within the half-mile because in theory, anywhere within that half-mile could serve the same need. And so they draw a circle on the map, they look at all the properties in there, and then they start looking at things like topography. So if, for instance, there's a big ridge in the middle of that half-mile, then properties on top of the ridge are going to be useful to us. Properties next to the ridge are not going to be useful because there's no possibility to get service up the ridge. We have to build an enormous tower, etc. So we start with that, and then what we do is they actually do look at zoning, because it's, if there's an industrial property, if there's a school property, if there's properties where it's easier to get a tower permitted, where it may not be as objectionable to neighbors, we always want to go there first, definitely. And so we'll look at those. And so, for instance, last night we had a project in front of the Planning and Zoning Commission in Ketchikan. What we did there is we went down the road where we wanted to do a tower, and we approached every single industrial or commercial property to find a spot that would work. But we looked at it from an engineering perspective first, and we went through and our engineers did a model for each of them, and most of them were ruled out from that perspective. And so we were like, okay, unfortunately we have one option that's commercial, one option that's residential. Then we go to the commercial property, the landowner says no, and so then we move on to the residential property. So to a certain degree, it's sort of we're ruling things out as we go, but we do always start hoping to be able to locate on a property that's less obtrusive, on a property that is commercial or industrial. And the challenge is finding something that's within that half-mile circle that meets our RF propagation needs, and then, quite frankly, where the property owner is willing to lease to us. I mean, if there's an industrial site that would be ideal, but the property owner doesn't want anything to do with us, there's really nothing we can do about that. In that context, in the wireless context, we're not a regulated utility. We don't have the power of eminent domain. We've got to make a deal with the landowner, and so that's always a limiting factor as well.
Great.
Are there any other questions?
One final question, this might be for staff. Other communities within Alaska, is there any guidance on cell tower regulations, say in Fairbanks or Juneau, that we can look to? Or maybe actually, I'm sorry, I guess industry can answer this too. Are there other communities that have adopted cell tower regulations that we should pay attention to or we should look towards?
There are a lot of communities that are currently adopting and have adopted and revised their ordinances recently. The Mat-Su Borough just recently adopted a new ordinance. I know they went through a long process of they engaged outside consultants. Ken was on the phone, maybe able to speak to this in greater depth. He was more intimately involved. They engaged outside consultants, weren't happy with the result, ended up coming back and revising again. Fairbanks has a fairly functioning ordinance that they operate under. There are a number of smaller communities that are starting to adopt ordinances. I believe Juneau recently revised as well, but I don't have a lot of information. Ken may be able to speak to that as well. Ken, can you hear me? Is he still there?
Ken, are you still on the line?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Can you speak at all to other communities around Alaska that potentially have adopted a process or regulations that we might look to for input?
Yeah, so a number of communities have actually started to adopt rules that are specific to the new SEC rule that was discussed a little bit earlier. In other words, essentially adopting a kind of an expedited review process for upgrades and modifications that would fall under that particular rule. As far as like brand new wireless ordinances, I think that Becky mentioned a couple. One would be Mat-Su as well as Juneau, both had adopted rules, and they had engaged an outside consultant. And I would, really caution, I think, Anchorage on that direction, just because they hired a company that was so far away down in Florida called Cityscape, and the process and certainly the ideas that they brought forth were probably just not appropriate for the types of facilities that locals perhaps would want to see. Certainly near Florida, maybe a stealth, mono palm tree would look good, but perhaps not in the middle of Anchorage or Juneau, right? So it's important to note that there's certainly a lot of changes going on to wireless codes, but certainly to the extent that there could be somebody that can perhaps understand the values associated with the place where the rules need to be put into effect, I think as we generally see are perhaps a little bit more successful.
Oh, that's helpful. Since we have you talking, would you like to add anything to the conversation?
I would agree with everything that Becky has said. A couple of notes I would just say, just on things that I've heard. we're beginning a pretty rapid migration away from landline wireless service. I mean, in the last 10 years, we've seen a tremendous adoption of wireless as people's primary means of communication. So it's important to note that many of the existing sites, whereas we could build them in industrial and commercial and perhaps along highways and places like that, where you would expect to see infrastructure like this, I think you're seeing a trend definitely as people are, the usage is really growing where people live. And that means that there's likely to be more wireless facilities that are closer to where people live. And so, on behalf of AT&T, we certainly don't object to having sites that can integrate well with the neighborhood, but it's important to recognize the importance of these types of facilities and just how people depend on them. And not just, of course, to conduct their everyday life, but certainly for emergency purposes as well as they conduct business as they are at home. Just notable, AT&T has actually experienced a 50,000% increase in its data traffic over the last 7 years. So, whereas you may not necessarily see population growth grow that explosively, the amount of data that individual customers are using is really growing exponentially. And that is driving really the demand and the type of improvements that continue to have to be made in order to keep up with that demand.
Sure. Ms. Johnston has a question for you, too.
Sure.
This is kind of to AT&T and Verizon just because they have more national experience, but have you seen a trend where there's going to be sort of a transition, since we are going more wireless, to get rid of the landline, the infrastructure for the landline? Because I could see not putting it in code, but putting a general perspective that as we develop cell towers, we get rid of landlines because as they become antiquated. And I didn't know if you're seeing this anywhere or if the industry is seeing this in lower 48 as a general mission.
Yeah, generally speaking, I'll try to take a stab at that. No, I don't think we're seeing landlines being removed. It's important to note that the only thing wireless about a wireless network is the handset itself, the phone that's in your hand. The entire network still relies on a wireline backbone to connect to the internet, to connect to services, in order to make sure that your calls and data go through. So certainly we've seen rapid migration, people dropping perhaps some of the consumer landline stuff, but that doesn't mean that there isn't still a need for it. And certainly the wireless network, ironically itself, of course, depends on elements of the wireline backbone in order to provide these types of services.
And when you're saying wireline backbone, I mean, this is beyond the fiber optics cables you're talking about the landlines that are throughout the neighborhoods as a backbone? What do you, I mean, when you're saying?
Yeah, primarily, it depends on the site. I mean, we depend on both, depending on the type of site and the type of technology that's being offered. But we have connections to our site that might use some of the older T1 type of connections. Certainly, as things are becoming faster and faster, we're relying more on a fiber backbone for sites to be able to provide really the kind of speed that people do expect.
So it is more of a fiber optics backbone system versus the traditional telephone line.
Did you have anything else you wanted to add, Ken?
Yeah, the only other thing I was just going to highlight of what Becky said that I wanted to just reemphasize is that I do generally believe that the cities that have figured out what they want want these sites to look like, and have been able to incentivize those types of facilities, really, I think end up having the best outcomes. They end up having the best, looking infrastructure. They've been able to kind of go through a process and identify what these things should look like, and then through their process, really encourage carriers to build those types of designs, build in those types of locations, and that really does produce I believe the best outcomes. And so, as perhaps some consideration is given to a new code, certainly looking into those items, I think a process that's associated with those types of designs and location would be very important.
Thank you. Did you want to follow up on anything, Becky?
No, I think that's it, unless there are any additional questions.
Are there any other committee members that have questions, comments? Okay, next I'm gonna, thank you very much. I'm gonna ask Jake from MLNT to give us a little 411 on his, I'll just move out of the way.
Okay.
On MLNT's policy and co-location.
Yeah, so let's see, about 2013, GCI and MLP came to an agreement with allowing them to attach their antennas on the top of our poles. This is the first telecommunication company that we've had this agreement with, and so far we've allowed them to approve to 2 of our poles. They haven't attached one yet, though, for reasons you might already know. However, let's see, there is a pretty strict process on our end, and we have a lot of restrictions, I would say, that protects MLP interests. We definitely look at let's see, the safety of not just the community, but also of the linemen that are going to be working on these poles that are maintaining these facilities year-round, 24 hours a day. Let's see what else. Let's see what other. Pretty strict process. We had both a professional engineer that they will hire to evaluate the drawing, and then of course our engineering and staff also approves the drawing. And it does talk to issues that you've discussed today, such as wind and the strength of the pole. We require any pole that's over 55 feet to meet a nonlinear analysis, nonlinear loading analysis, which is pretty strict in its. It does require, one of the circumstances that actually required for the design, the pole to be changed out to a thicker pole because the current pole wouldn't meet the current or the new nonlinear analysis requirement. So I would say MLP is definitely making sure that safety standards are being met and avoiding any catastrophes of falling down.
So a question I have is when a carrier approaches MLP and says, I want to attach to that pole right there, what is the process? Is it just, so obviously there's some engineering analysis, but does it go to the director? Does it, how does that process work within MLP?
Yeah, the first step would definitely be getting an agreement in place. The joint use agreement doesn't just cover attachments on poles, it also covers if they want to joint trench with us, if they want to use their wire lines on all our poles. And so we have a agreement with GCI, and then ACS is also, it's not signed one, but we have one with them. And then the selection thing, if they wanted to ask this particular pole, we would look at how it affects us. I know Verizon actually had called and asked about that. They wanted one specific pole. However, we had RUS standards on the pole, which means we have a line already on top of the pole. So it would have had to reconfigure the whole line. And so we pretty much flatly said, no, not on this pole.
Mr. Trainee?
Do you have a co-location policy? Looked at the poles with the rest of the telecommunication industry? Or is it just with GCI?
The only agreement we have is with GCI right now.
Is anything stopping the other companies from approaching it?
No, they can approach us. I'll have to maybe actually ask Quincy on the FCC language there, but I believe we're also somewhat required to allow them to attach, but we have the right to, for engineering reasons, say no.
Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so when someone approaches you to, say, rent the top of your pole, do you look at a projected, I know you're supposed to be undergrounding a certain percentage of your lines every year. Do you look at the projection and say, well, we're going to be undergrounding that in a year or two, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to put
well, yeah, I mean, if we were underground in the next 5 years, as part of our 5-year plan, I would definitely let them know and let them know that risk of doing that. Something that could be addressed, maybe planning wants to take a part of that, is when we do underground, what happens to that pole? Do they still stay up, or are they going to be required to go underground as well? Because right now, the Title 21 language says when the pole owner goes underground, everyone on that pole has to go underground.
Right.
Which they wouldn't like to do.
But that's a different issue. I mean, that's not about cell antennas, that's about wired lines.
Well, it says everything attached to the pole. So if they are attached to the pole, the pole and all its attachments would have to come down. So I didn't know what, maybe you want to make an exemption to that, or maybe GCI is fine with taking their stuff down. I don't think they would. Something to think about.
That's in the utility undergrounding part of code.
I think that would solve everybody's problems if we could have underground wireless.
Unfortunately, rather.
I know. I was like,
Bad coverage.
man. I just solved it all. Did you have anything else for us, Jake? That's helpful.
Well, I can definitely, if you guys want a copy of our agreement, I can send that to anyone. Yeah, feel free to ask me any questions.
I actually have one follow-up. So, what influenced the content of that agreement or the terms of that agreement? Do you have a policy in place that says these are the requirements for any carrier to meet if you'd like to enter into agreement, or did you, since this is so new, did you guys create it?
We created it brand new,
Okay.
looking at, the ones that are in lower 48, and
Okay.
what kind of requirements and safety things that we wanted. So yes.
Thank you.
Did you have a question, Jennifer? Anything, Mr. Evans? Jerry, anything?
I have a question about the safety of people that maintain that antenna that go in your utility. Did you, when you're developing the policy, built in who was going to have to be there to do the maintenance and the qualifications of those people?
Right. Good question. As per the National Electric Safety Code, anything that's above what they call the power space, which would be MLP line above, has to be operated by certified linemen, which GCI I don't believe is in. So they would actually have to hire MLP or a certified lineman approved by MLP to do that work, and that was what we had agreed upon.
And you've done two, the one in South Edition, and where's the other one?
The 13th and E, yeah, that was the one we approved, and then we approved one off of Northern Lights and Glenwood.
I thought it was innovative, but I assumed that you had provisions in place with respect to the maintenance that were appropriate.
Are there any other questions?
Can I speak briefly to the maintenance thing?
Oh, go ahead, Becky.
Just a point about the maintenance thing. I mean, that's one of the reasons that these projects are somewhat more difficult for a provider to propose, because we do have to coordinate maintenance with MLMP and consider, using linemen and whether we need the power outage, et cetera. And so that's just sort of another piece where if this is a desirable project, incentivizing it really helps a provider to feel interested in doing this kind of project, because they are going to be more difficult for us to maintain over time and will impact whether we might have service outages that we can't immediately address and so on. So it's just another factor that comes into play when we think about that kind of project versus a freestanding monopole structure.
Great. Anything else, Jake? All right. No other questions from committee members? Okay. So now we've had presentations from the planning department, from industry, and from MLMP. So I think it really gives us a lot of good food for thought. And I think we can all see that everybody's agreeing we need to address some issues within cell phone towers within the code. So now it's the opportunity for us to hear from community members to either, comment or raise questions or give possible suggestions. Because we have so many people here and we do have another agenda item, I'm going to limit everybody to just a couple minutes. I'm not going to time you, but if you start getting if you start going on too long, I'll ask you just to wrap it up. So with that, are there any questions, comments, positive remarks, suggestions? And again, please just state your name again.
I'm Tony Sisto. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just very quickly, it's been very, very good discussion. I really appreciate it. Obviously, I'm from a residential area, and obviously you get probably a lot of your complaints or concerns when a pole was put in the middle of an established mature neighborhood, which was what happened in my neighborhood. So I think that's where some concerns come in. So I would like, when looking at code revision, if something like that has to happen, if there can be an extra layer of scrutiny perhaps by the assembly before it goes through planning and zoning and the conditional use permitting section. I think GCI and others do their best to try to find a place other than that if they can. Then secondly, how does it work when there's a new neighborhood being planned and platted, and for instance, Powder Ridge and Eagle River, where there's going to be X number of houses coming in? How do cell tower companies get involved in that at the planning stage where people, when they buy into it, know that's going to happen? So I guess that's the question.
I was going to say that is a good question, and we have, I don't know if Joanna can speak to it. We have a member from Eklutna here. So I I don't know, I know you may just be here. We have a couple, actually. Do you guys want to talk about? Yeah, go ahead.
Steve Conley with the Clune. It goes into the planning process. So, I mean, we have a CUP in process right now for a substation. So it's in a preliminary plat. It's going to be there before a house is even built. People are going to know about it. So yeah, we do try to, look into the future here and see what's going to be needed.
And due to the fact it's a public process, I mean, I guess we haven't particularly called up everyone and said we're building a 1,500 home residence over the next 20 years. Are you going to participate as GCI or whatever? It's a public process. We imagine that they're keeping track of those things as well, and we want to be a part of our planning process. But we have to go through those stages and show what our master plan is for the area, what the densities are in that area. We did plan out a specific area for an MEA substation. A school was purchased in that same area for that same pre-planning for what's going to be there in the future. But again, it's market driven, so as an entity that's going to provide service, will every single home have one? Maybe, but it's probably a cat and mouse kind of thing.
It seems like getting ahead of the game would be
As
very
helpful as
for people
possible,
buying.
knowing that this is out there for 20 years, the planning process is safe.
Did you have
Madam
anything
Chair, one quick more thing. I know there's maximum heights that are allowed without getting a conditional use permit. I think there's, in our area, I think it's 85 feet. I know it changes. It seems like those are a little high, especially when you're dealing with residential areas. And I just request a look at that here in the And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Any other
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Lance Conley again. Becky, if I could ask you, and I'm asking you as a representative of GCI, it's safe to say there's a lot of permits and a lot of goes into getting a pole presently. In your process, are you involved with those antenna locations, those pole locations?
In selecting where we propose as a potential location.
Okay, are you aware of any requirement for the community input, like the residential community input where the tower is going?
In terms of before we proposed a site or once we proposed
in other words, can you show that GCI has gone to the community and asked for their input?
We can always show that we've gone to the community council when we have a site to propose. Generally, we don't go to the community council until we've selected a site that will fill a gap, in part because we may not know which community council district it's going to be in until we have figured out where there's an available site. We definitely always do go to the council as part of the approval process, and we have in the past, if there's a reasonable alternative suggested, we definitely go and explore those. We have, we're looking at these powerful structures, and we have some folks who've suggested different locations. We'll definitely go consider whether or not that's something that's an option. Again, we have no interest in trying to build towers against community opposition if we can help it. So we do go to the community council once we selected a site. We don't before we've selected a site. I apologize.
And that's good that you do get their input, but is it required?
I believe it is required under the code. Erica, you probably know better than I do. I think we have to go, for everything with a CP, we have to go to the community council. But
Well, it depends if we're talking new or old code, but certainly there's nothing in the, if you're still not deciding where your site is, there's nothing that requires you to go out and discuss them.
yeah, that part isn't there. But once we've selected a site and we'd like to go forward with permitting, then we do.
Actually, in the old code, I apologize, for a CUP, you are required to.
Yeah, for CUP, yeah, that's what I was thinking about. We do have to if we need a CUP.
And it's more than just the box that you check as an application saying, did you get community input? You check the box, yes, we did. Is it more than that?
Oh, it's way more than that.
Okay,
Definitely.
great.
We proposed a project in Chukiak, and I think that our site acquisition team went to that community council maybe 6 times. I mean, we definitely are trying to get as much input into the design process and the site selection process as we can to try and build a project that, there's only you can only mitigate a cell tower to such an extent, but we try to do it as much as we can and to work with the community to figure out a way to pick a site and to disguise that site in a way that is satisfactory.
Mr. Reaver.
Question, since we have all 3 providers here, are the cells becoming smaller with the newer technology with respect to your capabilities that we should? Because anecdotally, I've heard this from one provider that cells will be becoming smaller and would therefore need more antenna. closer together. So that's, instead of just towers, perhaps we're looking at antenna. And that probably has to do with the data flow and the usage and the amount of data, but a lot of other communities have gone to using municipal infrastructure of utility poles, lights, signal, all, across the board to kind of diminish the need for big towers.
That is part of the small cell. That's what you're talking about, is the application of small cell technology. And there, to use small cell technology, you do need to have more structures that are shorter. And again, as I said previously, we're not quite there yet with our Alaska network, but that is what will happen and what's happening in some places outside of Alaska, more dense urban populations are able to fill in some service gaps after they already have the existing tower structure they need, fill in additional capacity gaps by using more frequent small cell technology. And
Ken, do you have any comments on that? We may have lost.
Whether or not they...
Did you hear the question?
I think I did. This is about whether or not there's a trend to go to smaller facilities, particularly perhaps denser. Was that generally the question?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it kind of depends. I mean, yes, certainly, as was noted earlier, there is a carrying capacity to the number of traffic and then cell sites carry. And so, you don't see cell sites down at the top of mountains, near urban areas. You certainly see those sites that become split up into smaller areas. Certainly, the sites have to become closer to the users, the customers, the people that are actually using the service. It's important to note, though, that small cells, at least in AT&T's view, it's a very limited application. It does not work everywhere, and in many cases, it's dependent still on kind of the macro site network. And it's just used to fill in little gaps here and there, or provide additional spot capacity to, perhaps areas where there's high traffic. Certainly, special events and things like that. Obviously, there are distributed antenna systems, usually in stadiums and things like that, that require a lot of traffic. The other thing I would mention is that as far as the antennas that are attached to existing structures, it depends on whether or not there are existing structures that we can attach to. Certainly in urban areas where there might be some mixed use or some taller buildings, certainly those make great opportunities to co-locate antennas on. If there aren't that infrastructure that has any sort of that vertical infrastructure doesn't exist, then it certainly it becomes harder. You have to look for other alternatives like utility poles or towers or things like that. The only other thing I would mention is that we are, we receive frequencies. We buy licenses, and the FCC auctions off licenses that carriers use, and oftentimes those frequencies that we're using are at different bands of the spectrum. And in order to be able to carry traffic on all of those various different spectrum bands, we've actually seen some of our antennas actually grow in size. Whereas, maybe we could get by with a 4 or 5 foot tall antenna. Now we need an 8 foot antenna, and maybe it's a little wider, in order to be able to provide the service on all those frequency bands that have been given, that we've acquired from the FCC. So there's a lot of things that go into it, but generally speaking, you are seeing smaller, I guess more frequent facilities as opposed to the ones on the mountaintops. So.
Thank you. Are there any other comments, questions? Yes, go ahead.
Heather Nolan, resident. I just wanted to highlight a couple of the key points that I've been hearing today and reiterate them, because I really appreciate all the conversation. I think that there's a lot of smart people here, and we can definitely find happy mediums that work for everyone. Height is definitely a concern next to principal residences. NATSU is looking at 100% fall zone. There was a tower that fell in Willow in 2013. It does happen. I'm not saying 200% fall zone is necessarily correct, but we know within residential areas and being in a windy state, we know that there's concern there. Design. I absolutely love the idea that Ken was talking about, is coming up with these design or aesthetic ideas so that we can fast track some of these towers and get some of this pushed through faster for everybody. But knowing that the residents of Anchorage have some kind of input into the aesthetics and keeps with the aesthetics that we're trying to bolster our town as a great place to live, and really work on coming up with some of those kind of guidelines or criteria would be great. I also wanted to touch on the fact that the community council, the process right now for public hearings and the community council, they do take off the summer, and there have been multiple times where I've seen these particular towers where they hit right before the community council goes on their break during the summer. It happened with the Arrow Northern Lights tower, and then this particular tower with the antenna and equipment on 13th and E. And just didn't give the community or the neighbors enough time to really talk about it or discuss it. Everybody's out fishing for the summer. So I would say that I would really appreciate a good thorough review of that actual process. I do appreciate the idea of actually notifying the residents, not just the property owners, because there are some pockets of the town that are really high rental usage, and if these renters aren't getting notified that they're going to be impacted by these towers, then they don't have an opportunity to have a voice. And just wanted to say I appreciate the conversation.
Great comments. Yes,
Just
go
make
ahead,
a comment about the community council meeting. So if it is important, like you said earlier, I mean, the virtual community council is meeting tonight to just solely address substations. So I mean, it's up to the community councils can meet in the summertime. They got to get on the ball and just kind of do this stuff. They can't just say, hey, we're done for the summer. You know, somebody needs to be tracking that.
Maybe I should move to your community, because my community council needs to be unplugged.
It does always depend on the area, but they hold special meetings, and so, and that's kind of what we decided at the Chukiak Council, the same thing. It was, well, we are going to adjourn until September 4th or whatever, but if a notice is coming available, it will be made public, and potentially a special meeting will be put together in order to address that. And in the case we're going out and we're doing a site visit where they can walk, where they're proposing the NBA site at Powder View, so that they can actually look at it and view it. So those things happen, and as a developer, we want to make sure that we've done it, but it's frustrating as a developer to have done all those steps and then find 8 months down the road, oh, we don't like it now. Well, everyone else liked it for months, and all of a sudden now you don't like it. What? We're starting backward and starting over again to just try to be good neighbors and notify and alert and do as much as we can, and then it's just spotty sometimes on the participation. It's spotty sometimes on the goals and the motivations, and things change for neighborhoods. They change for values of people, you know, and so you're always constantly juggling that and making sure it does. I mean, market changes, values change, you know, the home colors change, everything changes, and you just kind of have to, oh, okay, now we'll go this way. Oh, now we'll go this way. And it's just be patient. We're trying. It's not a goal of ours to terrorize the neighborhood or do anything like that, but it's frustrating to try to be doing all of these things, and then it all changes on you all the time.
It's definitely a two-way street. There has to be involvement. And there are several residents here that have been expressing concerns, and that's what we're saying, is there's interest.
Good comment, Heather. Mr. Trainee.
Some community councils do meet 12 months of the year. It depends on the community council. So try moving to Campbell Park Community Council. They meet every month.
Heather,
Two good options.
I have another idea for you too. Depending on how your community council is structured, well, I'm thinking of Eagle River Valley Community Council. They have one person, their sole responsibility is to watch P&Z. Yeah. And so, depending on what your bylaws say, you might be able to potentially, you know, most bylaws will say there's provision for calling a special meeting. So even if the officers don't want to call it, if you can get 10 residents or 20 residents, whatever it is, to call a special meeting, that's another option too, because then they have to show up. So it just, you know, the dynamics are so different with each council, but it's another idea to float within your council.
I heard you say that a little bit earlier, and I thought I would contact my community council president, find out a little bit more, get involved, because
right. Well, Mr. Trainee's seen this before with councils, and sometimes you'll have a president who just doesn't want to call a meeting, And so when that happens, there are mechanisms usually within your bylaws to get around that. And if you ever have problems, just call the assembly chair.
Give me a ring and I'm happy to connect you with them, okay?
He's been.
And always look for people to run for office and community councils.
Well, that was my next step, was to start getting involved.
Show up and you'll be surprised. Volunteers.
All right, we have about 5 more minutes on this topic. Are there any other questions, comments, suggestions? Oh, yes, go right ahead.
My name is Teresa Arnold, and I just wanted to reiterate the issue of the fall zone. Our code, I think, is pretty clear about that, and there's a cellular antenna attachment proposed for my neighborhood, and it will increase the height of the pole by, well, it's 15 feet of cellular equipment. I think it would increase the pole height by 10, maybe 10 and a half feet or so, but which brings it up to almost 80 feet, maybe 79, something like that. And it is clearly, it was definitely within a 200% fall zone, but I think even if we had a 100% fall zone, it would still fall on the house right across the alley, probably the one next door to it, and the church, and maybe an additional one, I'm not sure. So those codes are important. I doubt that these cell antennas fall over very often, but they do occasionally. They catch fire if they fall over. One did in the valley. I think Heather mentioned that one. And that's why Wasilla is implementing the 100% fall zone, for that reason. So I would like to just see them safely, responsibly deployed and aesthetically appealing. I mean, we've seen photos, I've seen photos of the small cell technology in Chicago and Minneapolis, and it's really nice. And I love my cell phone. I like that it works, and I appreciate it. I use it every day. But I think we can do better. The one proposed behind my house, it's of a crow's nest type. So that's what we were told, but it would be similar to the one on Arrow and Northern Lights.
Where's the proposed tower that you're talking about?
1220 E Street. So it's at the corner of 12th and E, right behind the Church of the Nazarene.
Yeah.
So yeah, we were told that the most similar is at Arrow and Northern Lights. So we drove by there, and it's a crow's nest. So
well, I can tell you, I haven't quite seen it yet, but Miss Johnston has one right outside of her window.
I look at it
every day
for my sink, and you know, so when I've had cell phone issues, I've always been able to say with a straight face, I know just what they look like. And you know, there is a trade-off, as there is with any utility, between you having usage of your cell phone and how we deal with this issue. And you know, I've had folks say to me that, well, you should only put those in industrial zones. And I said, have you ever looked at the land use map of the city of Anchorage, and how would your coverage be if you really want to use this? So we have to, I mean, it has to be a community and a greater good discussion. And that's where you get the frustrations with community councils when the greater good and individual rights have a colliding disaster.
I understand that, and I respect it fully, but in a residential area near homes, this thing is right out our front, back, and side doors, and I just think it could be done better. I think there's another site for it that this communications company is looking at, but we haven't heard anything else about it. So
the other thing with fall zones, and as a committee, the Title 21 committee spent a lot of time on fall zones for this and for wind and whatever, and none of us were engineers. But you know, as you look at a fall zone, you have to think of the predominant direction of wind. I mean, what would cause this to fall? Earthquake or wind? And that kind of, I think you can direct what kind of fall zone is required and what would happen, versus what we took was a very broad stroke because we were just clueless.
Comment. And I think that's why it's so important to actually start here when we're having this conversation. It's because, you know, the carriers can hear our concerns, you know, and I say our because, you know, we're all part of the community, but and assembly members and the administration, everyone is actually at the table talking. And we will come up with a path forward. The goal is to mitigate the impact because we know technology is going to require these things. And how do we do it and minimize your life as much as possible? And I will soon know how you feel because we recently approved a cell tower literally across the street from my house, out my front door. So, I mean, this affects all of us, even if we live in Chugat. So.
Was the palm tree design?
I'm going to go to Jillian and then you, Bruce.
I'm just curious, I guess I'll ask ML and Pete if that's okay. Is there a requirement for fall down distance for the light poles or a height restriction in residential?
No, it's just the strength requirements of the pole.
Strength requirement based on seismic and
Right, it's not based
wind?
on, I mean, there is a little bit of a clearance, but we're talking like from the pole, we don't know anything about the pole.
Okay. That's probably a difference between a freestanding and part of a grid.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Well, interesting enough too, and in the GCI letter, when they're talking about fault zones, they point out the differences in code between other standing items that don't have any fault zone, but if it's a cell tower at the same height or similar, there is a 200% requirement. So I think it's a good point to bring up to discuss, is there equity there, and are we protecting you the best we can? Bruce Schulte, welcome.
Hi, I'll be brief. I'm here for the moment representing the Southport Master Association, for which I'm the president. And I just want to share with the industry folks, we had an incident a couple of years ago where AT&T/Singular proposed a cell tower. And, most people involved in the discussion, we can see that this is a technology that is, it's here to stay, and I'm probably one of the 42 people left who has a landline in my own home. But I want to share with you the process, because what happened there was a representative for the carrier came to the homeowners association, showed us what they had in mind, received a lot of comment. It wasn't all positive, but it was constructive, and part of that comment included some alternative locations or sites that they might consider. They didn't act on any of that. What they did was they went to the assembly and they negotiated a lease agreement on a piece of property behind the fire station. And I still believe that the assembly acted in good faith based on the assurances that they had the support of the community, and they did not. They basically misled the assembly into voting on that lease. And ultimately, we had to hire an attorney, and it was very expensive, very contentious, and it's left a very, very bad feeling in the community. So I was asked to come here to express that. So that's a done deal. That tower's not going in, but I just wanted to offer that and point out that if it had been handled differently, that tower might actually have been built in some fashion. But because of the way it was handled, the community rose up in absolute outrage. So I just want you to...
I appreciate those comments, and I would say I would bet there's probably examples you can find like that. And I can tell you from the one that was just approved in Chugiak, GCI was the tower that was just approved. And they came to the community council, and it was packed with people who did not want it in this one specific location. And through the discussions of the council, it was asked of GCI, did you assess all the potential locations? And there was one they were made aware of, happened to be across the street from my house, that might be an alternative. It was within their little circle that Becky was talking about. So essentially, they brought us a map and said, this is the ideal location. Here's the circle. Does anybody have any ideas? And ultimately, GCI abandoned the first site, and they thought they actually, when they found out about it was an AWWU well house site. When they found out about it, they found that was actually a better site than the first site, in their opinion. So, it does happen, and I'm sure, but I think that's why it's really important for us to have clear standards for them, something that's predictable, and it's something for us as residents. We can say, okay, these are what we expect when a cell phone tower comes in. You're going to mitigate whether it's camouflaging. If you're going to camouflage, we're going to incentivize you to do it this way so it minimizes impact, the fall zone, all those things. And I think that's why it's important to have everybody at the table talking today, because those are the things we're going to, and when everybody knows the process and it's defined, I think it'll give the community some solace too. Jennifer.
The thing that was interesting about Southport, that happened to be in my district, I worked with Robin on it, is it's an interesting situation because Southport is a new development and everything is buried. So it's something to keep in mind as far as how we're looking at these, because then you couldn't say, well, you've got all of these high wires and all of the utilities out there, and you're complaining about this one industry. This is putting up something where everything else is buried. So it's, and it was on PLI land, it was on the fire station, and it came with many different issues.
All right, well, we're going to go ahead and close this comment or this conversation today. My intent is to essentially ask 2 of the committee members and 1 of the ex officio members to create a sub-working group and come up with basically potentially a draft on something that we can start circulating among the community councils and the public to get input. Oftentimes, and I will just give this warning ahead of time, sometimes people will say there's no good public process. The public process is to draft something, to introduce it, to circulate it for comment, and then should we need to amend it, change it, whatever. So it's not that we're trying to sneak anything in, but we have to have some working document in which we can get comments from. So you can anticipate in the next couple of months you'll be seeing something regarding cell phone towers, but we'll definitely make sure that we get it as widely noticed as we possibly can. I know I haven't sent agendas to the FCC and the Chamber of Commerce, hoping to get a lot of people today, and I'm glad we did, Mr. Trainee.
Once it's drafted, I will take it to the Federation myself. I mean, once a month, so I'll take it. You come with.
Perfect. I used to.
I want to make sure we get it out to the Federation.
Okay, perfect. Mr. Schutte, did you have a comment?
Oh,
You
no.
have your hand up.
No, sorry.
Oh, you're just stretching.
Just stretching.
Okay, wonderful. Well, if you guys want to sneak out, or if you want to stay for the rest of the meeting, that's fine. We only have about 5 minutes left, so if you leave, please leave quietly. Thank you. All right, very quickly, we're going to just, I think, Erica, do you have any comments or updates for us on the marijuana draft? Anything moving, changing? Not really. Okay, I didn't think so. All right, so we will go back to that. Unfinished business. Did we have a timeline from P&Z on their land use plan map?
So we had a work session with the Planning and Zoning Commission yesterday, and we laid out all of the projects that are coming towards them this fall. We did discuss maybe starting some meetings a little bit earlier to allow for a little bit more time in the evening, although also then to end them a little bit earlier. Perhaps Mr. Robinson can chime in, but I heard a willingness to consider extra meetings, but not a commitment to hold extra meetings.
Well, I think what we talked about, because typically you have a public hearing and then you have an issue response from staff and then a resolution. And by the time you run through that whole process, it's usually 3 months at the Planning Commission once it even gets to a public hearing draft. So from public review draft to then it's, a 5 to 6 month process, which clearly doesn't get us to December. And so I think what we talked about is having a meeting, the first meeting in November and then the third meeting in November with staff providing an issue response after that first week. So
Was there a commitment for the
I
third
think
meeting
there
in
was,
November?
there were only 5 of us present, so I think there was general, to try to meet. There was also a desire to say, okay, if this is top on the list for the community or for the assembly, then if there are other quote-unquote urgent issues, whether it's stream issues or whatever, that we recognize that they maybe get bumped by the land use plan map process. And so that was the conversation.
Well, and I think at this committee, we've had numerous conversations, and I won't speak for the rest of the committee, but I think especially when we're talking about integrating marijuana and marijuana industries into the community, we're talking about all these different things. I think it's very important to have that land use plan map done so we can start to lay out a plan and a framework. And, I think this is just a very important piece of the puzzle. I don't know if it's just me, but...
Well, I work in multifamily housing, which aside from cell towers is probably the next most controversial issue, and I think a land use plan map would help a lot. So we've been recognizing that for a long time. And so I think there was commitment from those present to move it forward.
Mr. King?
We really need this because I understand what you're talking about, multifamily and cell towers. Marijuana is going to the top of the list.
Yeah.
Once we start determining where the facilities can be for that, we've got to have a map to make this work.
We do mixed use, so we can add them all in there.
I think they're going to be needed in Chudiak personally.
That's right.
Okay.
So if that works for your desire, what I heard, which is that it get to the assembly at some point in December, there's a resolution process that may not but I think we can get it there.
Just to clarify, are you saying the first week in November and the third week in November?
So we typically meet the first 2 Mondays of a month,
Right.
and I think what we suggested is that there be a
Space them
third,
out.
because the
Oh,
staff's
and a third.
got,
Okay.
well, we would do 1, 2, 3 if there were enough private cases online, and that would be the third meeting.
Okay.
We got to look at attendance and all that.
Perfect. Well, I think we would be very excited if planning and zoning would be willing to do that, because this is something we're trying not to leapfrog, an important component. We want to make sure if we have to start deciding what zoning districts all these different marijuana industries are going in, it would be very helpful to have that map, I think. So.
Yes, one last question. Are you guys fully staffed in your commission, or do you have any vacancies?
We are, there's, I think, two seats up in October, or 2 or 3 up in October, but currently we have 9 members.
Want to make sure the administration brings for a replacement so we have a,
Right.
don't have a drop.
On our radar.
Thank you.
Or reappointments.
Either way.
Either way.
I just want the seats not to be empty.
Right.
There's 3 seats up, 2 of them up. 2 of those people have indicated they do not wish to be reappointed.
Oh,
Okay.
There you go.
All right, so that's it. That's going to be an important piece. And then just for members, information, we've been talking about the final industrial lands study, and a meeting of the whole has been scheduled, a work session of the whole has been scheduled for Friday, August 21st at 11 a.m., City Hall, room 155. So that'll be, I think, a good one to come to. I have already extended and just let MEA be aware, because if we're looking at industrial lands and potential significant industry growth, we know a lot of those areas are out in my area. So I want to make sure MEA has the ability to understand what's going on and plan their capital program appropriately. So just that. Has anybody given any thoughts to the committee mission statement? I think we've talked about it a lot, and Mr. Evans left, so I'll just put that on the agenda for next time too, and I'll just kind of bug him a little bit more.
Was that his idea?
Yeah. Well, every committee has to have a mission statement, so it was his idea to change the name, so he's getting wrangled into helping with the mission statement.
Okay.
But we take comments and advice from anyone, so
I'll prod him.
that would be great. Yeah, that would be great.
Not that you're just anyone.
Just a guy in a blue jacket, that's
Just
all.
a guy in a blue jacket.
All right, and then lastly, proposed topics for the August 19th meeting. One of the things we're talking, I don't think we're going to be able to do that for next week if Dennis doesn't get back. All right. So I'm going to reevaluate this. We're working on, we know there's 2 AOs in front of the Assembly right now, 2015-83 and, 76 and 59 regarding Title 21 changes. And there's been an expressed interest among the committee and the makers of those to collaborate and see where we can come together and see if we can actually move it forward.
And you know that Mr. Evans and I are working on that, and we're with Mr. Schutte, and
Okay, so
we have-
let me back up for just a second. 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, Mr. Hall approached me and said he was willing to get with Mr. Evans too and have a conversation.
We did that.
And I think it's important when we have a collaboration that both sides are at the table.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's very important that Mr. Hall is involved in the process.
And he was. We had a meeting, Ernie, last Friday.
So I know Dennis is going to be coming back, but it's important to me that it's not just a one-sided.
It isn't a one-sided. It's trying to get all the elements without having a problem with open meetings law. And so it was the 3 of us that met, and we'll try to come up with a product for you, a nice version. But since
So I think August 19th is a little ambitious.
Well, but Ernie and I are gone.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, Ernie and I are.
AML and Ketchikan.
So I think I'll go back and rework it, just like I did last week. I'll try to send the agenda out very early, but I will, we'll look at the 26th. The 26th. That'll give us 2 weeks because, to work through, a compromise. But I'll just reiterate, it really concerns me that I hear that you and Bill are working on the compromise because.
It's been the three of us, but we can't have more than three.
Oh, I know. I'm not, hey, listen. A compromise usually means taking out the strongest personalities, so I have ejected myself from the mix, and I'm more than happy to let, Ernie take the lead on that. So we'll bring it back on the agenda to the 26th.
Could I just sneak in a comment? People who have been watching these two bills are very anxious that there'll be enough time to get out past these walls into the neighborhoods before it goes before the assembly.
Well, a lot of this stuff is, it's all we're doing is we're taking what planning and zoning has done with it. The materials for the 76 was an ordinance that we worked on all winter. And so that has had a long engagement. It's gone through the public process with planning and zoning. You saw the first two ordinances, public process has begun with the assembly. We're trying to collate all of that into an S version.
I'm just saying there are a lot of folks who don't know about this.
Right, and that's, it's somewhat our responsibility, somewhat their responsibility. We have taken over a year to make some of it not very substantial changes. And if we continue to do that.
I'm asking for a decent amount of time between the release of the document and it goes to the assembly.
Well,
and I don't know what that time is, but it's more than a week.
With the assembly, with an S version, the way it is done now, is if you have an S version with substantial differences from the original ordinance, then first of all, in the aim, it has to describe the substantial differences. And that it is a 2-week notice, so the S version, if we have it finished by this next meeting, it will go on the agenda, it will be in the public, and so the public has a chance to look at it at least 2 weeks before it's brought up for public hearing in the assembly. More than that, Cheryl, we get bogged down, and one of the problems with Title 21 from the get-go is that we've been bogged down for 15 years. And so, I hear you, but I'm just saying this is the public process. We're following it, and there's just so much that we can do because you've already had it, one bite of it in front of the planning.
So last night, just to clarify, the assembly postponed both of these ordinances to September 29th.
September 29th?
Yeah.
The new target?
Yeah, so that we postponed it to then, but we don't have a work product, and you can tell because of open meetings laws, not more than 3 of us can talk about it.
I'm hearing.
So that's why I'm bringing it up.
September 29, and then if you potentially bring it to this committee when?
August
26th.
26th.
You think you'll have a product by August 26th?
Hopefully that's
the kind of time.
So about a month.
We need a month's time basically to get it out.
Yeah, about a month. So that's the hope by bringing it to committee. I mean, the hope is, we can kind of hammer it out and whatnot. I would say just for, and I don't even know, I'm just about to throw him under the bus, but I don't even know if he's willing to do it. But from my perspective, I still, I know you and Mr. Hall are both going to be gone next week. And I know you and Bill are working on this too. I would like to add, I don't know if Tyler's willing.
He's been working
part of
with
it
us.
too.
He's been working. We're
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I would just like to say, I just want to make sure that I have a diverse group that's working on this issue. So you can kind of, go ahead.
Actually, I'm just trying to draw your attention to Erica. She wanted to add a
Oh,
comment.
didn't see you back there. Sorry, Erica.
Thanks. I was just wanting to ask Jennifer how, if an S version is finished 2 weeks before it's on the agenda, is that posted somewhere? Because the agendas usually aren't posted until about 4 or 5 days ahead of time. So I'm wondering how people access that.
No, it's because what happens is the S version has to be posted for introduction, and then you have 2 weeks after that.
I don't think that's true, Jennifer. So just so
If
we don't
it-
have this information, I'm not sure that the new code is a 2-week requirement.
If-
There is a new code.
Yeah.
a-
It says there has to be an
that you have to have an AM that explains the differences.
And if there is
Even if there's a
substantial,
there is not a requirement that I know of in the Assembly's code.
Well, we can just make sure it happens.
yeah.
But by practice, as they have said, they've tried to do that. I don't think that that's a code requirement.
Well, and the other thing that I'm not adverse to either is after we bring up the S version in here, provided the S version doesn't need substantial changes before it's introduced, I'm not adverse to posting it under this committee on the web, so people, if they want to grab it, they know where to go to grab it. And I'm not opposed to either introducing it and letting that public process happen well before the S version comes in.
And perhaps the Federation.
Yeah, oh, for sure.
Although hopefully they get their link right.
I know. It confused a lot of people because their link didn't work and they kept emailing me. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I didn't realize that S versions were introduced separately. I think sometimes they just,
Sometimes they just show up.
It can be hard to find legislation of all types that are coming in front of the assembly before they're actually posted in the agenda. So there's some way to make sure that that's out there.
Right, and I mean, honestly, sometimes S versions are laid on the table, so.
Yeah.
Just as I know everybody knows this, but in order to hit the ground in May of next year, you're in for permits in March, which means we're designing projects already for next year, right? So I think that's, everybody knows that, and I know that the community wants time to weigh in, but I can tell you that the project side, we're already designing projects for next year's construction cycle.
And I think that's why it's so important right now, if we clearly articulate to people, this is what we anticipate the process to be, this is how we will get you the documents or where you can go look for the documents. So on my end, I'll make sure to talk with the clerk and beef up our committee's presence so people can find the documents we're talking about. I think whether it's cell towers or Title 21, people are going to be interested. So
I have to ask, it sounds like the committee is open to other people besides the 3 assembly members. Will they be posted for other folks who might want to look in?
We're just working as people who have been drafting these ordinances. We've taken what we've heard.
But it is beyond the 3 assembly members.
Well, no, but right now, for redrafting an S version, we're doing the legislative process. That's what we're doing. And the reason we have Mr. Schutte is because he's there to represent the administration, and Tyler's there to represent what's happened with planning and zoning. So we make sure that we've incorporated the public process into...
And I have concerns about the balance of the information that's coming to the assembly and to this committee about the committee segments. So I think it would be fair
you'll have that in the
folks
public.
from, for instance, the previous planning and zoning commission that approved the previous standards represented so that they could explain why these numbers were put in place. I appreciate that you have Mr. Schutte. It's great to have staff there. I know I was quite frustrated when staff's presentations were not allowed to be completed on the Open 59. So I think that's great that Mr. Schutte is now representing staff. But again, I'm looking for more balance.
So let me just say one thing.
That's part of
when
the
we go to what we're talking about, we're talking about like a sub. It's not really a committee. It's just a working group of a couple people that are trying to draft an ordinance. So when we're talking about open meetings laws, literally 3 assembly members can't more than you can. So, but legislation is never drafted with a big public working group because you never get anything done. So what they're doing...
You have to be a big group.
No. What they're doing is, as their smaller group, they're going to come up with an S version, then they'll bring it to the committee, and all those voices have the opportunity to weigh in that you're talking about at the committee, and that's before the assembly ever is going to hear this S version. So I think we're a great opportunity to get a lot of input too. And then beyond that, at the assembly, it'll be open for full public testimony too. So we don't want to circumvent public process at all. Yeah, and we're happy to have a work session too. So.
I think there's a difference between the official public process and then the perceived process and who is participating in it.
No, and that's the point of having our committee meetings this open. I mean, we've had a different take on how we're doing them now, and I think that's what we're trying to incorporate.
And the way you're running the meetings now is great. I appreciate that.
Thanks. All right, well, we run a little bit over. I'm so sorry to keep you guys. Thank you for coming, and we will see you next week.